Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Michelle Dowd. I'm a professor of English at the University of Alabama, and I'm a trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America. It was my privilege this past year to serve as the chair of the inaugural SAA First Book Award Committee, which seeks to recognize monographs with a significant Shakespeare component published as the first book-length publication by current members of the association. So in 2023, we had 4 outstanding finalists for this award, and we wanted to create an opportunity for SAA members to learn more about these books through a series of short, informal conversations with their authors. So today, I'm delighted to be speaking with Ben Higgins, who is Career Development Fellow in English Literature at Lady Margaret Hall at the University of Oxford. His first book, which was awarded honorable mention for the SAA First Book Award, is Shakespeare's Syndicate, the first folio, its publishers, and the early modern book trade, published by Oxford University Press, there it is, in 2022. So welcome, Ben, and congratulations.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Thanks so much for having me.
It's wonderful to speak with you, and we'll look forward to learning more about the book. So I thought we'd just begin kind of with a sort of general question about asking you if you could just give us a brief overview of the book. What are your central claims or arguments? And maybe what do you see as its primary intervention in Shakespeare studies? Especially you're taking on a big, this is the first folio. So, I mean, it's a huge topic within the field. So we'd love to hear a little more about how you're approaching that.
Thank you very much. That's a really generous and expansive question. I'll perhaps just quickly start by saying, first of all, how delighted I was to be a finalist in this award. The other authors, this is such a brilliant group of exciting books, and I'm just very honored and happy to be mentioned in the same breath as those people. So yes, thanks very much to SAA for doing that, and also for hosting these interviews. It's the first time I've been interviewed about this book. So I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to summon up some articulacy about it. It is a big thing, the first folio, and also it's a big year for the first folio. So obviously there's probably lots of us have noticed there's a kind of carnival of anniversary celebrations, folio 400. That was totally fortuitous, kind of happy chance timing. It was not at all, on my part at least, planned. I mean, the project didn't kind of gestate thinking about how can I bring it to fruition at this amazing moment, but I guess I'm happy about that. So you asked sort of summary of the book, and then its broad claims or stakes, I think. And I think so. I think I'd say, for me, I think there are sort of 2 areas that I'd separate that into. So one is the object of study itself. So the first folio. There's such a long history of scholarship to that book, obviously. What my book brings is a fresh kind of reconception of the history of how that book was published. So it tells a new story about how the first folio was created by turning to the team of book trade businesses named partly in the book's imprint and partly in the colophon at the end of the book after Cymbeline. And it uses those businesses to think a bit about why do those businesses matter in terms of shaping, creating this document that with which we are all so familiar. So it's a sort of new history of the first folio told through those businesses. So that's sort of one area in which I hope there are kind of new things that the book drags out of the archives and brings to light. And then the other side of things, I think, for me, was sort of methodological stakes. So something that I'm proud of in that book is that I think I've tried to make an intervention into the kind of crossover of Shakespeare studies and book history. So it's a field, particularly working with stationers, book trade agents of various kinds, that's really flourished over the last sort of couple of decades. But I think that field, one of the tropes of that field has been the sort of case study, whereby you might find a particular stationer, Thomas Pavier or William Jaggard or someone, and then give a kind of, sort of case study account of that figure. And one of, I think, the subterranean conversations of that field that's been growing a bit louder is sort of what to do with this accumulation of case studies, these various fascinating, riveting book trade figures. There's something there that says something like sort of what does this add up to, or how can we kind of break out of this way of thinking, way of working with this material. So I hope that this book offers a sort of fresh take on how to tackle that methodological problem. There's more I can say about that, but perhaps I'll just stop there. And so those, I think, are the broad things.
No, that's great. And I love that you talked about method, because I felt that that's something I definitely wanted to ask more about or hear more about in terms of, how you're bringing together book history and Shakespeare studies, but also doing something fresh with those things with a book that has been discussed so much, right? Of course, as the first folio, and thinking about the way in which the sort of multiplicity of labor that goes into producing, which I guess maybe kind of counteracts a little bit that sort of solitary case study model where we're just looking at individual figures. So, I mean, maybe one way to expand then on what you're just said is, I wonder if you could expand into an individual chapter to kind of flesh out, give us some example or an example of how that works. Like if there's a chapter or even a part of a chapter or maybe part of a couple chapters that you could maybe describe in more detail for us that would highlight the methodology that you were just talking about. That would be, I think, really helpful.
Yeah, great. So maybe I'll start by explaining an idea behind it, and then I'll give a particular example of that, which will be one chapter, and I think I'll talk about a figure called William Aspley, the station of William Aspley. But I think you described that really brilliantly there, that problem of trying to sort of break out of the singularity mode, and in a way, the text that really forced me to confront that problem was the colophon at the end of the book, which attributes, probably most of us know that the colophon, early modern books, many of them have colophons. It's this sort of ritualistic printed statement that arrives at the end of the book and quite simply attributes the agency for the creation of the book to the stationers involved, and usually gives a date and sometimes a place. So the first folio's colophon tells us that the book emerged in London. The imprint actually, I think, says London. But the colophon just tells us that the book was printed at the charges of William Jagged, Edward Blunt, John Smethwick, and William Aspley, and then it just gives a date of 1623. So it just names those figures. And it was just that text and sort of what to do with it that I think made me confront this methodological problem, because the way that these studies have worked, or the scholars that I admire, the way that they've worked with this sort of material in the past is to go agent by agent, and that colophon brings together four. So you've sort of immediately got a question or a problem or a challenge there, which says something like, to what extent are you just going to repeat a method across four figures here and then create something that, I don't know, is a bit iterative or repetitive maybe, or, it really kind of exposes, I suppose, the inherently collaborative and plural nature of the book trade. And that fundamentally is a fact that I think book history has struggled to grapple with, because it threatens the way that we organize agency. And actually that heuristic agency, the single-centered consciousness, that's such a useful category. It's such a sturdy and useful category for us when we're in our methodologies. And that first folio colophon just kind of cheerily dismisses and waves away the idea that you can attribute it to anybody. Anyway, so it was that colophon text, I think, and thinking with that text and what to do with it and how to respond to it, that was the sort of stimulus for this methodological problem. And then, so the example, I think I'd like to talk about this figure, William Aspley. So he's one of the stationers that I treat in this book, and he's in chapter 3, I think, in my book. And I'm going to choose him. I'm fond of that chapter. I'm proud of it. And I'm also fond of William Aspley. He's one of the two figures, William Aspley and John Smethwick, who are kind of the also-ran figures of the Shakespeare first folio. So lots of early modernists know Edward Blunt, and probably lots of early modernists also know William Jagged and his son Isaac Jagged. But there are these other two, William Aspley and John Smethwick, who kind of hang around the edges of the first folio. I mean, quite literally, they only appear in the colophon. And I think scholarship hasn't quite known what to do with them. They seem quite marginal. Should we care about them? Maybe we shouldn't. And it sort of was fun thinking, how can you recuperate a marginal figure into the history of, let me just get rid of those so that doesn't happen again, into the history of this book, basically. And so the way that I did that, thinking about this methodological problem of the case study and how to kind of break out of that, was to think about Aspley as representative of this much larger category of book trade agent who had only a tiny slice of Shakespeare's literary estate. So William Astley is involved in the first folio, basically because he inherits the rights to 2 titles. So to the second part of Henry IV and Much Ado About Nothing, which early on in his career, he co-registers with Andrew Wise, who's a much better known Shakespearean publisher. Andrew Wise dies, we think, or at least sort of goes away from the record, which means that William Astley becomes the sole owner of these rights. And so 20 years later, when the first folio project gets off the ground, he's kind of dragged into those discussions, but he's not really interested in them. He actually spends those 20 years working on this religious writer, John Boyce, very little known, supporter of James I and VI. And Astley pursues this religious writer with great fervor, gathers all of his books, all of his copyrights, and issues loads and loads of dozens of these quarto books of this writer, John Boyce. Doesn't care about his Shakespeare copies. So that's his kind of broad history. And as I say, he is then, in Histories of the First Folio, a footnote, really. So what the chapter in my book does as a way of working with or responding to that problem is to pull back a little bit and ask, what might the consequences be of a literary estate where there's a couple of figures that own significant chunks? So that's people like Thomas Pavia, maybe, who owns about 4 plays. It's a good chunk. And John Smethwick even owns a good chunk of 4 plays. But many, many more people, partly because of Shakespeare's popularity, partly because of, I think, the theatre and the way that the ownership of rights gets distributed from the theatre, many, many more book trade agents own just a tiny little bit of Shakespeare, maybe one text. And so that chapter asks, what might the interpretive consequences be for this particular model of literary ownership? And Astley, I think, is a great figure to ask that question, because alongside this kind of half interest, this splintered little curiosity that he has in Shakespeare, he has this really devout interest in John Boyce. So he has everything of John Boyce. John Boyce, whose work he also transforms into a folio collection. So Astley as a figure, I think, is really brilliantly represents this sort of minor Shakespearean, kind of major Boycean. Both of these authors have these models whereby their quarto editions are transformed and gathered into these folio collections. And as it turns out, at least this is the argument of my chapter, there are some really profound consequences for an author's estate if you're only owned by one person, or if you're actually owned by 30 or 40 figures, like William Astley, who maybe only own just a sort of tiny little bit. So yeah, that's one example.
That's great. Yeah, and I think it's I enjoyed reading that chapter as well, and I think it kind of illuminates the little lesser known figures, but also it kind of touches on what you were saying about some of what you were saying about methodology in terms of these different ways of owning Shakespeare, I guess, in this instance, or of kind of that the folio wasn't put together by 4 people who did the exact same thing or who were participating in the same way, right? And so it's kind of unearthing some of those differences, right? And I think that's an exciting example. So thank you for sharing that. I wonder, we can come back, I think, to some of these broader questions about the book, maybe in our conclusion, but I wonder if we could divert just a moment to think about your method or your practice.
About the clock.
Oh, that's fine. We're talking about methodology, but I mean the method, the kind of more practical method of putting together a first book or writing a book, right? It's certainly a difficult task. It's a huge undertaking, many years involved. Obviously, all the labor that goes into that. So I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share with us just a little bit about that process for you, what it was like to write this first book, and if there were things in particular that helped you to do it, or to help you, get across that finish line, or things that you found, just as useful resources. And I'm thinking here too of people who might be watching who are working on projects. It's always great to hear, I think, from and learn from other people's experiences with their own, what's been, helpful for them or successful for them.
Yes, sure. Thank you. I think this is a really important conversation to have, and I'm really happy to say some things from my experience. I think it's increasingly the case that you need a monograph these days to find security in our industry. And, for instance, I after I finished my doctorate. So the book was originally my doctorate, like lots of first books, I think, are. And I had a series of fixed term jobs after that doctorate, which often means moving between institutions or picking up new teaching courses and making new working relationships, reinventing your professional identity somewhat. So I think it's I personally found it a very difficult process. Now, on the other side of it, it's immensely rewarding. And I'm very proud of the fact that I totally overhauled that doctorate and, rewrote the entire thing. I wasn't someone who I felt like, oh, yes, that thesis needs light touch renovation, maybe just another chapter and then it's kind of done or something. Or so I reconceived the whole thing. And in lots of ways, it felt like going back to do battle with problems I'd been living with for quite a while. Now, as I say, I'm really glad that I did that. I feel like it's the version that I should have written in some senses for the thesis, but perhaps wasn't ready to write then. So yeah, I think maybe the first thing I'd just say is, yeah, it's really hard. It's really tough to do that for all kinds of reasons, not only intellectual, but also just, one's security in the industry and all those sorts of things. The condition of happy, creative, intellectual work is really that you need to feel to some extent secure. And that's a problem for our industry at the moment. I think just some sort of quick practical things that I think helped me. One is, I think, definitely talking to people. So, whether that's a particular problem for a chapter or whether that's, I don't know, to get a sense of how best to approach publishers and how that conversation should go. But talking to people and talking to the right people. I think we all have people who feel like they're sort of on side or supportive naturally, or with whom we just feel aligned in some way. So I'd really encourage anyone watching this who's working on that first book to reach out to people who are around them, who they're, you'll kind of know who your allies and ambassadors are, and, be a bit vulnerable maybe, but just make that connection and ask and talk things through. That definitely helped me, I think, reading drafts and things, but also discussing problems. I think, so that's one thing, talking about things. I also think I came to think about writing as a practice which wasn't measured by the number of words that I did, but by my ability to sort of show up. That was helpful. So I thought, like, I've had a good day's writing if I've done, I don't know, a couple of hours where I've sat down, that's my writing time. And maybe you didn't write anything. Maybe you just kind of stared at a page and you worried and you deleted some stuff and you had less at the end of it than you did at the start. But that, I think that's okay to think about that as showing up. I think, it's such a rich intellectual project, and it isn't just about your word count fluctuating. It's also about, show up, confront that stuff, face the things that you're struggling with. So yeah, I think showing up, that was good. Maybe a couple of other really quick things. I'm a visual person, so I think that helped me quite a bit. I occasionally use things like whiteboards, or I'll sort of, cut things up even and kind of move them or print things off and move them around. That sort of helps me get an overall sense of control. Argument, this is flabby, that doesn't belong, that kind of thing was very helpful. And then the last thing I think is you have to have self-belief. I think you have to back yourself. For anyone who's currently working on a first book, that probably means that you've made it, if not through doctorate, then pretty close to being through doctorate, which means that, you're incredibly smart and you're more than capable of doing this. And I think first book can feel like it's a kind of out of reach, mystified thing. And it really isn't. It's, it's just showing up and putting in the time and believing in yourself. Those would be some things.
No, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing, those, range of interesting strategies. And I like the, that kind of, that kind of almost repetition, like the showing up, that it doesn't have to be, I don't know, like a huge undertaking every single day, but it can just be a kind of a simple, you're doing it, you're showing up, it doesn't, you don't have to have 12 pages at the end of that day to have been successful. And also the collaborative nature of that conversation that you started with, I think is important, because it's kind of like the flip side of that showing up. Like on the one hand, writing is so solitary, right? But on the other hand, the work we do, I think, is so, fundamentally collaborative, right? In many ways, but ideas, through conversations, conferences, conversations with your, your writing groups or your scholars and friends. So kind of finding that balance, I think I like that, you kind of touched on both of those aspects there, which was, I think, really helpful.
I'll maybe just also say, just very quickly to add to that, I think important for me was moving from doctoral student to working professional life. You just take a little bit more control, I think, over the people to whom you look for authority and feedback. And I think, taking control of that network I think is important. You know, as I say, you'll know the people that kind of work for you and work, and yeah, investing in that and growing that, I think, is important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah. So then let's switch back. We can move back sort of by way of a conclusion to sort of back to your project, but also, you know, kind of thinking about, you know, now that you've completed your project, you know, and the work you've done on that, putting it into sort of some bigger context. So I'm kind of thinking in two ways. One is about for you, like what might be next in your work. You know, is this project led you to other, you know, things that you want to do or that you're currently working on? So that's sort of one question. And then the sort of other side of it is how you might situate your work, the book, you know, in like the future of, this is a huge thing, but like the future of Shakespearean scholarship. But like, you know, what do you see as coming down the pike? It may be either in particular about book history and Shakespeare studies, or any way that you want to think about that. But I'm curious about, you know, having reached this pretty big milestone, right? If you have a sense of a sort of vantage point on what you see coming down the road for yourself and for the field, in whatever order you'd like to think about that.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you. Yeah, so I think that so something that came out of the book for me, and which is something I'm thinking about now as a sort of next thing, but which also I think, I mean, I sort of would think this, I suppose, because it's kind of it's the thing with which I'm preoccupied, but is also, I think, a feature of our field at the moment was a thing that had basically the idea of scale. So this relates a little bit to the methodology conversation we've been having about the difference between the case study and something larger, which in my case in this book turned out to be basically networks or collective categories of bookseller as a way of kind of breaking out of that individual thing. That, you know, that sort of problem of scale is alive and well, I think, in early modern studies, and is only growing as the incredible resources of digital humanities afford increasingly expansive ways of grappling with the primary record. So, you know, now we have databases that let you look at things like all of early modern female complaint poetry or something like that. Or, I don't know, things like Zach Lesser and Adam Hooks's Shakespeare census, which suddenly lets you look at all of the copies in certain ways that we have that survive of Shakespeare. So there are these kind of increasingly macro projects going on. At the same time, I think we're also really interested in copy-specific stuff and, you know, kind of compelling studies of the thing that's been found that is incredibly rich with its readerly marginalia and speaks to some idiosyncratic encounter from 400 years ago. So the movement between these different modes in our field is something that I'm really interested in. I think partly that has to do with a sense that I like community. I like the idea that we can find a language which helps us talk to each other and sort of figure out a broader conversation. And I think scale is one thing that might sort of help us to do that. So that's one project I'm working on at the moment. And I'm a book historian, so the way I'm doing that is bibliographically. So at the moment, I'm writing a history of the copy as a kind of conceptual category. When did it come into meaning? What does it let you do? The edition, which is this kind of totally dominant of the 20th century mode of the school of new bibliography, but I think is now starting to come apart a bit as we move towards this slightly less well-defined notion of the work, which emerges in different ways according to whatever the platform is that you're working with in that moment. So that idea of scale, I think, is really important. I think something else I'll just mention, which isn't something I'm directly working on, but I also think is really fascinating feature of, you know, the sort of book history and Shakespeare world is I've seen loads of really exciting, brilliant work recently that has to do with exploring acts of organization and gathering and compilation and curation. So here I'm thinking about people like Megan Heffernan or Michelle O'Callaghan, or yes, Zach Lesser's recent book on the Pavia Quartos, or Ted Tregear's book on Shakespeare and anthology. So I think that seems to me a really exciting area of Shakespeare studies, where we're thinking about, okay, what does it mean to organize, to put things beside other things, and then kind of stand back, and what can we kind of do with that? That's something I think.
Good. Well, thank you. That's really, and it's really interesting to hear what you're working on as well. And so it gives us things to look forward to in terms of seeing the work that that you're doing, as well as, of course, other people in the field. Well, it's been a pleasure to speak with you today, Ben. Thank you for taking the time. And I know that people are, are interested in hearing about your book, Shakespeare Syndicate. So thank you for telling us more about that, and congratulations again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me and for doing this. And thanks to SAA.
Absolutely. Thank you.